Welcome back to CoinGraph Market, where we focus on structure over hype and long-term positioning over short-term noise. Because what is unfolding right now is not speculation, and it is no longer something the market can afford to ignore. The White House has just signaled that it expects the United States Senate to advance the crypto market structure bill, and in Washington, D.C., that word expect is never used casually. At this level of government, expectations are only communicated when the outcome is already coordinated, the votes are effectively locked, and the alignment between regulators and lawmakers has reached a point where reversal is no longer realistic. This moment represents the clear end of what can be called the maybe era for crypto in the United States. For years, digital assets existed in a legal gray zone where institutions could observe, experiment, or delay without consequence. That gray zone is now being deliberately removed. When uncertainty is replaced by a formal legal framework, adoption stops being optional and starts becoming mandatory. Financial institutions do not operate on emotion or ideology, they operate on compliance. And once compliance is defined, the system is forced to move, whether it wants to or not. This is where the conversation around XRP shifts from speculation to infrastructure. XRP is not waiting for permission to exist inside the financial system. It was designed to function within it. While much of the market remains focused on price fluctuations and short-term volatility, the real transformation is happening at the structural level, where payment rails are being evaluated, selected, and locked in for the next phase of global finance. When lawmakers move from debate to execution, banks no longer ask whether blockchain technology should be used. They ask which rail already satisfies regulatory, liquidity, and operational requirements. What makes this moment even more significant is that the United States is not acting alone. At the same time that U.S. lawmakers are finalizing a domestic crypto framework, Ripple has secured a major regulatory position in Luxembourg, placing itself squarely inside Europe's MiCA framework. This is not a symbolic development. A Luxembourg license provides passporting rights across all 27 European Union member states, allowing Ripple to operate regulated payment services across Europe without repeated approvals. That level of access is only pursued when large-scale institutional usage is the objective. The timing of these developments is not accidental. You do not spend years navigating legal battles, absorbing compliance costs, and coordinating across jurisdictions unless you are preparing for real-world deployment. This is not about enabling retail trading activity. This is about preparing the financial system for massive liquidity flows between the United States and Europe. As the U.S. moves from regulatory uncertainty to legal clarity, and Europe maintains a defined framework, the bridge between these two systems is being constructed in real time, with XRP positioned directly at its center. While the broader market remains distracted by speculation and short-term narratives, the reality is that the gray area is being erased by law. Once that happens, institutions are forced to choose between legal risk and compliant infrastructure. And history shows that when faced with that decision, they always choose the path of least resistance. This is why this moment matters, and why the end of the maybe era fundamentally changes the role XRP is positioned to play in the future of global finance. The most important detail in this entire development is not the bill itself, but the language being used around it, because when the White House publicly states that it expects the Senate Banking Committee to advance a crypto market structure bill, it is quietly confirming that the internal process has already reached its final stage. In Washington, expectations are not expressions of hope. They are signals of completion. By the time that word is used in public, coordination between the SEC, the CFTC, Treasury, and Senate leadership has already occurred behind closed doors, and the remaining steps are procedural rather than uncertain. This is why this moment matters far beyond American borders. A formal market structure does not simply legalize crypto activity. It forces every regulated institution to reassess its operational strategy. Banks, custodians, and payment providers cannot remain neutral once a framework exists, because neutrality itself becomes a form of risk. When regulators clarify what is allowed and how it must be implemented, institutions are compelled to move away from systems that create legal exposure and toward infrastructure that already satisfies compliance requirements. This is not driven by innovation, it is driven by survival. At the exact same time that the United States is locking in its regulatory structure, Ripple has positioned itself decisively inside Europe's regulatory environment by securing preliminary electronic money institution approval in Luxembourg. Most market participants underestimate the importance of this move because they do not understand the passporting power embedded within the MyCA framework. A Luxembourg license is not local, it is continental. It allows regulated services to be offered across all 27 European Union member states without renegotiating approval country by country, effectively turning one regulatory win into pan-European access. This dual alignment between the United States and Europe represents a strategic pincer movement that is rarely seen in financial infrastructure. Companies do not pursue simultaneous regulatory positioning on two continents unless they are preparing for real institutional demand. The cost, time, and complexity involved in achieving compliance at this level only makes sense when the objective is long-term integration into the global financial system. This is not preparation for retail speculation, it is preparation for large-scale settlement, treasury operations, and cross-border liquidity management. As the U.S. moves from ambiguity to clarity, the question facing institutions is no longer whether blockchain technology will be used, but which network already meets the requirements imposed by law. When compliance becomes mandatory, adoption accelerates not because of excitement, but because of obligation. Systems that were built without regulatory foresight begin to fade, while infrastructure designed for institutional use rises naturally to the surface. This is the environment where XRP's design philosophy becomes impossible to ignore. What the market often fails to recognize is that regulation does not slow down adoption. It filters it. It removes fragile projects that cannot operate under scrutiny and elevates those that were engineered to function within legal and operational constraints. The removal of the gray area forces a decision, and once that decision is forced, the financial system always selects the path of least resistance, which is compliant, liquid, and already tested infrastructure. This is why the word expect carries so much weight. It is not a prediction, it is a signal that the transition is already underway. The structure is being locked in, the rails are being chosen, and the window for speculation is closing. What follows is not chaos, but convergence, as institutions align themselves with systems that can operate at scale under the full weight of regulation, and XRP stands positioned at the center of that shift. To understand where a company is truly heading, it is never enough to watch its public statements or marketing narratives because real intent is revealed through behavior, and one of the clearest behavioral signals in corporate strategy is hiring. Ripple has recently made a move that speaks far louder than any press release, and that move is the hiring of Joe Kahn from Elliptic to serve as Client Solutions Director for the European enterprise market. This decision is not random and it is not cosmetic, because the type of professional a company brings in tells you exactly which phase of growth it has entered. Elliptic is widely recognized as one of the most trusted blockchain analytics and compliance firms in the world, working directly with regulators, governments, and Tier 1 financial institutions to ensure that digital asset activity remains within strict legal boundaries. Talent from this environment is not focused on speculation or experimentation, but on execution within regulated systems. When Ripple pulls a senior professional from Elliptic, it signals that compliance-driven institutional deployment is no longer a future plan, but an active priority. The title itself, Client Solutions Director, reveals even more. This is not a role designed to generate hype or promote price narratives. It is a role built to sit across the table from bank executives, payment providers, and financial institutions and translate regulatory approval into operational reality. The function of this position is to show enterprises how to integrate their existing financial infrastructure with the XRP ledger in a way that satisfies MyCA requirements, internal risk controls, and real-time settlement demands. This is about implementation, not persuasion. The timing of this hire is critical. Ripple is expanding its enterprise solutions team in Europe precisely as regulatory clarity has been established through the MiCA framework, and as the United States moves toward its own formal market structure. Companies do not build enterprise-level deployment teams unless there is already incoming demand. This kind of hiring happens when institutions are no longer asking whether a system is viable, but how quickly it can be scaled to meet operational needs. Europe, with its unified regulatory framework, becomes the ideal environment for this next phase of adoption. Europe is not being chosen by accident. Under MiCA, the region has effectively created the first large-scale regulatory sandbox for tokenized finance, where banks, payment firms, and corporates can deploy digital asset infrastructure with legal certainty. Ripple's focus on the European enterprise market reflects a strategic understanding that once institutions begin operating successfully in one regulated region, expansion into other compliant jurisdictions becomes significantly easier. This is how infrastructure spreads, not through viral adoption, but through regulatory compatibility and operational proof. What this hiring decision ultimately reveals is that Ripple is no longer positioning itself as a technology provider waiting for interest, but as an infrastructure partner preparing for volume. This is what adoption looks like before it becomes visible to the public. It takes the form of quiet meetings, specialized roles, and internal scaling rather than announcements and speculation. While much of the market remains focused on short-term price movements, Ripple is assembling the human architecture required to support institutional-level settlement. The transition from speculation to infrastructure is not loud, and it is rarely celebrated in real time. It unfolds through deliberate staffing decisions that align with regulatory milestones and institutional demand. The hiring of enterprise specialists rather than marketers or promoters is a clear indication that Ripple is preparing for a level of usage that requires precision, compliance, and reliability. This is the phase where systems are built to last, long before the broader market realizes that the groundwork has already been laid. The next piece of this puzzle becomes clear when attention shifts from legislation and hiring to the behavior of the world's largest payment networks, because large financial institutions do not experiment publicly unless they are preparing for structural change. Visa's recent partnership with BVNK to support stablecoin-based payment infrastructure may appear on the surface to be a simple innovation story, but in reality it represents a quiet admission that traditional payment rails are no longer sufficient for the demands of modern global commerce. Speed, cost efficiency, and round-the-clock settlement are no longer optional features, and legacy systems are struggling to meet those expectations. Visa's role in the financial system has always been that of a gatekeeper, sitting at the center of global payments and extracting value from slow, complex, and fragmented settlement processes. When an institution of this size begins integrating stablecoin infrastructure, it is not abandoning its position, it is adapting to preserve it. By enabling direct settlement to digital wallets, Visa is acknowledging that value movement is shifting closer to blockchain-based systems, where finality and programmability offer clear advantages over legacy rails. This development becomes even more relevant when examining the people and entities involved. BVNK is not operating in isolation, and its leadership has been publicly aligned with Ripple's ecosystem. At a major industry conference, BVNK's managing director appeared on stage alongside the CEO of Ripple's standard custody division, where the message was explicit and strategic. Ripple intends to be natively integrated into the flow of stablecoins, positioning itself as a core component of the infrastructure rather than a competing product. This distinction is critical for understanding XRP's role in the emerging payment landscape. Stablecoins are designed to represent value, but they are not optimized to move liquidity across disparate systems at scale. This is where XRP functions as the connective layer, enabling rapid settlement between institutions, custodians, and payment providers without introducing additional friction. In this model, stablecoins handle the interface with businesses and consumers, while XRP operates behind the scenes, facilitating the efficient transfer of liquidity across borders and platforms. Rather than competing, these systems complement each other, forming a layered payment architecture that aligns with institutional requirements. The historical context strengthens this interpretation. Years ago, Visa aggressively pursued the acquisition of Earthport, a company deeply integrated with the XRP ledger for cross-border payments. That acquisition was not a coincidence or a defensive maneuver. It was an early strategic investment in blockchain-based settlement capabilities. By securing Earthport, Visa gained insight, access, and technical familiarity with XRP-powered infrastructure, laying the groundwork for future integration long before regulatory clarity was established. What is unfolding now appears to be the continuation of that long-term strategy. As regulatory frameworks solidify in the United States and Europe, the incentives for large payment processors to deploy compliant blockchain rails increase dramatically. Once legal uncertainty is removed, hesitation becomes a liability, and institutions move quickly to integrate systems that can deliver efficiency without regulatory risk. This is the environment where XRP's design and regulatory positioning become highly attractive. The significance of Visa's movement is not in the announcement itself, but in what it implies about the future of settlement. When legacy payment giants begin aligning with blockchain infrastructure, it signals that the transition is no longer theoretical. The rails are changing, the plumbing is being upgraded, and the institutions that control global payment flows are positioning themselves for a world where blockchain settlement is not an alternative but a foundation. We are now entering the phase where the distinction between speculation and structural adoption becomes undeniable, and the market needs to understand that XRP is no longer a simple digital asset to trade. It is infrastructure being positioned for mandatory adoption. The passing of the Crypto Market Structure Bill in the United States, combined with Ripple's regulatory positioning in Europe, is creating a scenario where financial institutions will no longer be able to sit on the sidelines. The gray area that allowed hesitation, delay, and optional adoption is disappearing, and once that happens, XRP's network becomes a functional necessity rather than a speculative instrument. Financial institutions do not act on hype. They act on compliance and efficiency. When laws clarify what is permissible, organizations must evaluate the tools already available that meet those requirements. XRP, with its cross-border liquidity capabilities, compliance-oriented design, and European MiCA alignment, is uniquely positioned to become the go-to bridge asset. Unlike other cryptocurrencies, whose adoption depends on market sentiment or short-term price movement, XRP's adoption will be compelled by regulation and practical necessity, effectively guaranteeing usage at scale among enterprises, payment providers, and banks. What is unfolding right now represents a shift from a market driven by speculation to a market driven by execution. The casual observer still watches the price charts, hoping for green candles, while the real action happens quietly in boardrooms, regulatory filings, and enterprise integration meetings. Ripple is preparing for a level of transaction volume that the public has never experienced on a public ledger, and this preparation is methodical and deliberate. It is not influenced by retail sentiment, social media, or temporary market trends. It is built on infrastructure, compliance, and operational readiness. The history of institutional adoption makes this even clearer. When frameworks like MiCA in Europe are established, banks and financial providers do not experiment, they deploy. Similarly, as the United States codifies the crypto market structure, every regulated institution must choose between risk exposure and legal compliant rails. XRP, already aligned with these rails, sits in the center of that decision matrix. The significance of this alignment cannot be overstated. The market is transitioning from optional adoption to mandatory usage, and XRP is the only digital asset with the regulatory, technical, and operational foundation to meet that demand across continents simultaneously. For traders and observers still focused on retail activity or short-term price swings, the change may appear slow or invisible. In reality, the foundations for a systemic shift are being laid, and once the legal and institutional mechanisms are in place, adoption will accelerate with unstoppable momentum. XRP will no longer be merely an investment or speculative asset. It will function as the connective tissue of cross-border liquidity, a bridge that financial institutions are compelled to utilize. The speculation era is ending, and the infrastructure era is here, with XRP positioned at the very heart of global financial evolution. This is why understanding XRP as infrastructure rather than a trade is essential for anyone tracking the future of digital finance. While the crowd waits for a price surge, institutions are quietly preparing to implement the systems that will make XRP indispensable. Once adoption is forced by regulation and integrated into real-world financial systems, the asset's relevance and utility will far exceed anything that speculation alone could achieve. XRP is no longer optional, it is inevitable. We have now reached the point where the speculation era has ended and the infrastructure era has begun, and it is important to understand that the most powerful movements in finance often happen quietly, long before the broader market realizes that a shift is occurring. The United States is finalizing its crypto market structure bill, Europe has already established regulatory clarity through MiCA, and financial institutions, payment providers, and corporate treasuries are positioning themselves to take advantage of legally compliant rails. Ripple is at the center of this transformation, and XRP is no longer a speculative digital asset. It is becoming systemic infrastructure, designed to handle the massive flows of global liquidity that the traditional system has struggled to process efficiently. While the wider market remains focused on price fluctuations and short-term narratives, the real story is happening in boardrooms, compliance departments, and integration teams. Specialized hires, enterprise-focused teams, and partnerships with stablecoin providers are quietly building the operational backbone necessary for the adoption of XRP at institutional scale. This is what meaningful infrastructure adoption looks like: deliberate, regulatory-aligned, and methodical rather than flashy or speculative. By the time the headlines catch up, the rails will already be in place, and XRP's utility and adoption will be well beyond debate. The convergence of regulatory clarity in both the United States and Europe, combined with Ripple's operational readiness, creates a scenario where adoption is no longer optional. It is mandated by compliance and efficiency. Banks and payment providers will be compelled to select infrastructure that is already compliant, liquid, and scalable, and XRP checks every one of those boxes. Projects that were built for hype rather than function will be left behind, and the market will naturally shift toward assets that have the readiness, regulatory alignment, and technological capability to handle enterprise-scale requirements. This is why XRP should no longer be viewed as a simple trade or speculative asset. Its value is derived from its function as infrastructure that connects global liquidity flows and satisfies the compliance demands of regulated institutions. What we are witnessing is not a temporary trend. It is a structural evolution in global finance. While most people remain focused on short-term noise, the quiet reality is that XRP's network, licensing, and enterprise positioning are already preparing for the level of adoption that regulation is about to enforce. This video is for educational and informational purposes only. CoinGraph Market does not provide financial, legal, or investment advice. Cryptocurrencies are highly volatile and involve significant risk. Always conduct your own research and consult with a licensed financial advisor before making any investment or trading decisions. Past performance is not indicative of future results. Stay sharp, stay positioned, and stay quiet, because the most significant transformations in finance always happen before the crowd recognizes them. The gray zone is closing, the rails are being set, and XRP is positioned to become indispensable to the future of regulated cross-border liquidity.